my name is Meredith Saba. I'm a biological sciences librarian here at UC Davis, and we are pleased that you can join us today and throughout the week for Open Access Week 2010. So we have 5 great speakers we've brought into campus this week to talk about different aspects of open access. If you haven't seen the rest of the speakers, I can at the end put up a flyer with the rest of the talks for the week so you know who else is speaking. So this morning we're pleased to have Dr. Jonathan Eisen. He's an evolutionary biologist and genomics researcher. He primarily works in the Genome Center, is that correct?
Yeah.
He's also academic editor-in-chief for PLOS Biology, which stands for the Public Library of Science. It's a preeminent open access journal in the sciences, and he's pleased to talk to you about his journal today and also open access issues in scientific publication in general. So he's going to be passing around that attendance sheet, so go ahead and sign in so we know you're here. And also, if you want, just put your email address down, so if you wanted some updates on open access related library information in the future, we can send that to you. So, and with that, I'll give you Dr. Jonathan Eisen.
All right, and we end up being too loud or having too much feedback here. Am I getting feedback on that? I don't know where the speakers are, where this is getting. We need the mic, that's the only way to record it, or it's definitely getting.
Yeah.
Is that recording audio?
No, it's actually separate, but I have a way to record
Oh, yeah,
it if it doesn't work.
On?
See if that's better.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. All right, I've been a little bit sick here, so if I flake out in the middle of the talk, throw something at me, or let me know what's going on. And a little awkward with all the computer screens here, but if you want to Twitter while I'm talking or something, feel free. So what I want to do today is actually not really talk about PLOS per se. I want to tell you my story behind getting involved in PLOS and some of the history of PLOS, which I think will speak to why, some of the reasons why open access is important. And I'm going to talk about some of the different parts of open access because there's this word thrown around a lot in the community, open access, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there are sort of categories of what it means to different journals and different publishers, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. But really, the title should be PLOS and Me, and you'll see why that's the story, and you'll hear a little bit about the history, because I was directly involved in some of the history. And again, stop me along the way, but in interest of full disclosure, that's my license plate. I am involved in the Public Library of Science. I am academic editor-in-chief of PLOS Biology, although PLOS Biology is actually more like Nature than it is like a society journal. It's run by the professional editors, and I'm kind of like a senior advisor who they listen to sometimes and don't listen to a lot of times. But I'm still heavily involved. That's a shirt I'm going to be wearing later today at the Giants game. That's a shirt I made for my brother, who you will hear about in a minute, who was one of the founders of PLOS and is also a Red Sox fan. So I'm heavily involved in PLOS, and I have family involvement in PLOS, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And in the course of telling you this, I'm going to tell you how I got involved, because actually initially, maybe because my brother was involved in planning PLOS, I thought it was ludicrous at the beginning. We got into a lot of fights about this, including fights at various baseball games, or arguments about this. So really, I'm just going to take you through a few stories, which, the history behind how I got involved in open access, and then this little bit about the different flavors of open access, and probably not really talk about the future of open access, but talk about what I think some of the benefits are to the different components of open access. So just to tell you a little bit of the history, if you don't know, the Public Library of Science was started in about 2000 by 3 people. Harold Varmus, who had been head of the NIH under Clinton, Pat Brown, who's a professor at Stanford, and my brother, who was a postdoc in Pat Brown's lab and is now a professor at UC Berkeley. And There are a lot of reasons why all of them got interested in this from a variety of different angles. Harold Varmus, when he was at NIH, had the Congressional Budget Office do an estimate of how much money the NIH was spending from its annual budget on publishing. And so the annual budget at the time was about $17 billion, and he wanted to know how much of that was spent on, things related to publishing as opposed to things related to doing research. And I mean, I don't know if people know the answer to this, but when he did this, he expected the answer to be something on the order of a few $100 million. And it was over $2 billion of the $17 billion budget was spent on publishing. And what the Congressional Budget Office really did was include everything, the entire cost to NIH of publishing. And that included indirect costs that went to supporting, subscriptions to journals in some way, the salaries that they paid NIH scientists that they then, would review or work for journals for free for the journals, as well as all the publishing costs and everything associated with publishing. So a very enormous amount of money was going into publishing in general, much more than he expected. And Pat Brown at Stanford and my brother at the time had been working in part on this new genomic technology called DNA microarrays, where you take little pieces of DNA from an organism of interest and you spot them on basically a microgrid on a slide. And you can use this to survey the gene expression of all the genes in the genome at one time and do all sorts of interesting science with this. And Pat wanted to open up this field to everybody and release the specs for building these machines, as well as release all of the data associated with these microarray experiments. And they ran into all sorts of roadblocks with both publishing and sharing data that led them to be really interested in openness. So they started, one aspect of what they were interested in was open access to the literature, because they wanted to create a database of all gene information in various genomes, and they didn't, even at Stanford, they didn't have access to all the journals, and then they couldn't redisplay this information. So the first thing they did was create this petition, a letter that they circulated to a few people, including me. When I was at my previous job, I was at a Genome Research Institute, as I'll tell you about in a few minutes. But this is the content of the letter that they asked people to sign. The key parts were that they were talking about this establishment of this online public library that would contain the full contents of the published record, and that the people who signed this letter pledged that they would, both support publishing in this manner as well as not support publishing in other manners. That is, they would not review for journals that did not release their publications after 6 months, and that they would publish in journals that would release their publications after 6 months. So they got a large number of people to sign this petition. Actually, even when my brother sent me this petition, I didn't quite understand what the whole thing was about. But the main reason he sent me the petition was I worked at this Genome Research Institute that Craig Venter had founded. Craig was the person who sequenced the human genome at this company called Celera. And my brother really wanted me to get Craig to sign the letter, because that would look good for their circulation. I don't think he cared whether or not I signed the letter initially. But you can still go to the PLOS site and see all the people who signed this letter, and one of them was me, right here. So I did, in the end, sign this petition. They converted it from a faxed around document to actually an online petition. And a lot of people signed. So, in 2002 or 2003, they had 25,000 or so people that had signed this letter committing to this openness. And it basically had no effect whatsoever on open publishing, because people signed this and then they went back to their daily lives, and there weren't a lot of places to publish in this sort of open manner. And to them, openness meant sort of two things. The material came out sort of freely available after 6 months was the main goal in this openness. There weren't all these other layers of openness that we'll talk about in a little bit. But the main goal was to have the material be freely available to the broad community after 6 months. And lots of people said they would do this, and there were not many journals that were doing it. And the few journals that were doing it, including these journals from this place called Biomed Central at the time, were not considered a place that a lot of people wanted to publish. And so, after many meetings trying to figure out what to do, they basically came up with this idea of starting PLOS journals to create high-profile open access journals that might attract more attention than these low-profile open access journals had created. big. And they got a grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to do this, and they actually had to create a marketing plan, or Gordon and Betty Moore wouldn't give them any money. And so they created this whole plan to create these prestigious journals, including two that they started out with, basically PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine. And the main goal behind this was to basically prove that you could have open access publications. And as I'll tell you later, these were fully open access. That is, the material was freely available immediately and with no restrictions, so a broad open license for the material. But the goal here was to create visibility for the open access publishing world, and they recruited editors from snooty non-open access journals like Nature, Science, and Cell, and New England Journal of Medicine for PLOS Medicine and The Lancet and places like that, and they launched these journals in 2003 and 2004. And again, I still wasn't really convinced. You know, my brother was obsessed about this, and it sounded fine to me, but it didn't sound like the only way to go. But I agreed to be on the initial editorial board for PLOS Biology. And there's sort of an interesting related story here, which is I was working at this genome research institute called TIGR, the Institute for Genomic Research. And we were sequencing we were doing, at the time, about 50% of all of the genomics sequencing in the world. And we had enormous pressure from the funding agencies to release our data as rapidly as possible. And we did not want to release our data as rapidly as possible. We wanted to keep it close to our chest and publish papers on it and not have people look at our data and scoop us on scientific findings. So we had developed a aversion, a general culture of aversion to openness, because we were basically being forced to be open in the release of the data, more open than we wanted to be. And it was not part of our culture to talk about making openness even more, doing more openness. We were fighting for keeping access to our data. And I was a representative from our institute at this really big meeting where all the heads of all the major funding agencies and genome centers went to this meeting in Fort Lauderdale, where they came out with this thing called the Fort Lauderdale Agreement. And if you're familiar with the Human Genome Project, there had been this thing called the Bermuda Agreement, which was lauded at the White House by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and it was about open, unrestricted release of the human genome data. That was part of the billions of dollars the government spent on the Human Genome Project. And this was a follow-up to that agreement to see if, after the human genome had been sequenced, if we should do this for all these other genomes. And I found out a few things at this meeting, including that the Bermuda Agreement, the human genome data, despite the announcement at the White House, was not actually released with no restrictions. They lied. They had created a new database at the National Center for Biotechnology that explicitly was designed so that they didn't release the human genome data with no restrictions. And this came up at this meeting, and a couple of the people at the meeting said, this is crazy. We spent billions of dollars solely to release the human genome data for public benefit, and now you've created loopholes in the access to this data. And after this meeting, I became convinced that the Genome Center should be releasing the data with no restrictions. I still wasn't convinced about open access publishing, but I was convinced about releasing data, because the goal of these projects was to benefit the community, not to benefit the individual scientists. We were getting way more money than we should have gotten, millions and millions of dollars for each of these genome projects. Wasn't going to kill us to release the data. So I did this experiment in data release, which pissed off a lot of my colleagues, because genome centers weren't supposed to do this. So I was doing this project on this organism called Tetrahymena thermophila. A really wildly interesting single-celled eukaryote. And we were sequencing the genome of this organism. This organism has led to like 6 Nobel Prizes in research on the organism. It's a classic model system. And so we decided to release the data without this. So the caveat that they had put in for the human genome data, as well as our data, was you can look at this data. You can find individual genes in the data. So the human genome has 20-something thousand genes. You can analyze individual genes. You cannot do a genome-level analysis of the data. That was the restriction on the data, and that's the same restriction we put on all of our data. And I didn't put that restriction on this data. We just let it out there for anybody to do anything with. And I was actually out, for reasons that you will find out in a minute, when the data was released for this project, the first bolus of data, we sent an email around to the community, and like 2 hours later I got this email from a friend of mine, Patrick Keeling, who worked on this organism. Again, unrestricted access to the data was a good thing. Thanks for the message about the genome, it's a nice surprise. Lots of bacillus DNA in there, unfortunately. This turns out there was a database tracking error at our institute, and we were also doing all the work for the FBI on bacillus anthracis. And our database had bacillus anthracis DNA in it. And he was making a joke that now they were thinking there was lateral gene transfer, movement of DNA from anthrax into this weird bacillia. But without, sort of public broad release of the data, it would have taken us a long time to figure this out, this tracking problem. And because he felt like he could do anything with this data, he immediately put 2 postdocs on his lab onto looking at the data because we had released it with no restrictions. He could publish a paper on it that day. So he put more effort into looking at it, and they found this contamination problem, in hours after the data was posted to this FTP site. So this convinced me that open access to the data was a pretty good thing. In fact, rather than getting scooped by people on looking at our data, we ended up having dozens of collaborators come into our project to write up a paper on this genome of this organism. Something like 75 authors on the paper of this genome, most of which came after we released the data. They would send us a message saying, we found something interesting, would you like us to help with it? And so it's the exact opposite of what all the genome centers expected. So the sharing actually benefited our project enormously. And so I figured, okay, public access to data seems like a good thing, let's do an experiment on open access publishing. So we were working on this other project. We decided to submit the paper to PLOS Biology, even though Nature was calling us like every other week, asking when we were going to submit the paper to Nature on this microorganism's genome. And so we submitted it to PLOS Biology with a little bit of fighting with my collaborator who wanted to send it to Nature. Had not heard of PLOS Biology, but fortunately we did 95% of the work and he did 5%, so we outvoted him. This should have gone before this. There was an article written in the East Bay Express, basically, right before this, where they were talking about how my brother was having this hard time convincing even his brother to publish in open access journals, and if he couldn't convince me, this was the downfall of PLOS in some way. So the paper came out in PLOS Biology. It didn't negatively affect us to publish there versus in Nature. I thought that this was a successful experiment, and then I still wasn't, this was just playing around, right? We were still sending papers to Science and Nature, because when you sequenced genomes at the time, at least, you could write your paper in crayon and it would get into Science. They would publish anything about these genomes, basically. It was, literally, you basically called up the journals and said, what will you give us to submit the paper? Not, how many pages will you let us have? Like the first plant genome was a negotiation between Science and Nature about whether or not they would let us publish, giant fold-out pictures of chromosomes and whether or not we would be on the cover. It was not, is the paper going to get accepted? And so, we were still sending papers to Science and Nature, and then real life intervened, and I could go into this in detail or not, but the detail is not that important. My wife was pregnant with our first baby. There was a botched amniocentesis, terribly botched. She was in the hospital for a month afterwards with all sorts of complications and bleeding. And in the time that she was in the hospital, we switched to competent medical professionals from the original incompetent ones, and even the competent ones did not know what to do related to some of the treatment. So for example, I'm AB positive blood type, my wife is negative blood type. During the botched amniocentesis, there was blood mixing. They should have given my wife a RhoGAM immunization. They did not. This is the Rh antibody immunization, and they're supposed to do it anytime there's blood mixing. They didn't. So when we switched to new competent medical professionals, 4 days later, it was beyond the timeline when they normally give RhoGAM. It's supposed to be within 72 hours. But all the paperwork says within 72 hours. So what do? It's been now 5 days. I went to the literature. So 3 a.m. at night, we're trying to decide tomorrow morning if we're going to do the RhoGAM immunization or not, and I went to the literature, and I couldn't get any of it. It was, You can look up on Wikipedia, which says, everything has to be within 72 hours, and the supplier says within 72 hours. But I wanted to find out what the actual public, that's their recommendation, but did anybody study after a week? Is there a risk after a week? Is there a benefit after a week? Taking a shot is not necessarily something you want to do if they don't know. And so I went to look up the papers, and I got into one of these, pay $30 to access the paper before you even read it. So I worked at a place called Tiger. It had 300 people. It wasn't UC Davis. We didn't have subscriptions to anything. So even if I logged in by my VPN system, it didn't matter. We didn't subscribe to any medical journals. So I go to another one, same thing. And I actually bought, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., dozens of articles, trying to figure out what to do. I was calling up people in Sweden, trying to track them down because they had published some of these papers. My uncle runs the blood bank in Boston. He was trying to track some things down about this. And we didn't have a lot of time, but I was scientifically knowledgeable and willing to read the papers, and I couldn't get them. And even, I could pay for some of them, I couldn't even get other ones, and I suddenly realized what open access in part was about. I mean, this was just completely ridiculous. So eventually, after going back and forth with the doctors, my wife did get the Rogaine immunization, not that it necessarily helped or didn't help. And there were other issues going on too, and the same thing came up. We didn't have access to the literature, trying to figure out what to do, trying to help. Doctors are busy, even good ones don't necessarily know what to do in every case, and they have to consult the literature, and we couldn't. So I was done with the closed access publishing system after that moment. The baby was lost, not that we could have saved the baby from any of this online research. I mean, I think it was already a done deal, but it was just the combination of horrible medical emergency and not having access to any of the literature and having to pay $30 before reading it when I already paid for the research from my taxes. That was it for me. So since then, I've become firmly convinced that openness is a good thing, and I think that I'm an example of someone who was close to the open access movement and still not convinced until a couple of scientific and personal experiences. But since then, I've become heavily involved in PLOS and other things. And I think what I want to do for now is talk about these issues of the different parts of open access. Because what I experienced with the Rogaine and other things was really rapid and cheap access to the literature, which is a part of open access, but it's not the only part, and actually I think those are not the most important things in the end, even though that's what convinced me to become involved. So you will see people talk about open access in lots of different ways. There are university repositories, of course, where you can get free and sometimes unrestricted access to publications. Some journals like Genome Research, which I used to be on the editorial board of and have resigned from, they talk about open access, and what they mean by open access is they post to their website an article after 6 months after it's published. It's not unrestricted access, they don't share it with PubMed Central or other places. It's just sort of freely available on their website, but they call that open access. Science makes stuff available, some of the material for free on the Science website after you read. So now not only is it after 6 months and only on the Science website, you actually have to register and go through a multi-step process to get access. And then there's PubMed Central, and then there are things that are free everywhere. So what I've sort of done is, I'm sure other people have done this too, is divide openness and accessibility into these sort of 5 categories. And I'm sure there are many more, and I don't even, some of these overlap a lot with each other, and I'm certainly not an expert in some parts of these, like copyright. But there's sort of these 5 flavors. The timing of access. So when do you get free access? Is it immediate, or does it come along later? Where do you get access? And both of these, there's a big debate among some people in the community about whether or not, university archives or journal sites or full repositories are the right way to get access. So permission, what you can do with the material. So you can either have unrestricted or restricted reuse of the material once it's freely available. And then there are issues associated with copyright and licensing. They sort of overlap with each other, and whether or not the author gets copyright or the journal retains copyright. And related to the location of archiving is who actually is the responsible party for controlling the archiving. So if you publish in some journals, they will archive for you. If you publish in others, you have to do the archiving yourself. And so there's something that's generally called green access that you may see out there in literature. There's a couple of people who've been pushing this. And basically what green access is about is making stuff freely available at some point, which is great. The material will show up in an archive, like a university archive, but it is somewhere accessible on the web for free. But in general, with green access, it's the individual's responsibility to deposit stuff into the institutional or other archives. And this is great, it's better than no access at all, but what PLOS is about is all the things on the left side, and this comes from, you know, a big discussion of what open access is about at some meeting called the Bethesda Principles. But basically, PLOS papers are freely available in PLOS journals. They're immediately available. That is, you don't have to wait 6 months, and with some fields, a 6-month wait probably doesn't matter. But with other fields, a 6-month wait is actually a long time. The material is on journal sites, but they also deposit it into places like PubMed Central. And a key thing that I'll talk about in a minute is that the reuse of the material is unrestricted, and I'll talk about this in a minute, rather than there are rules about reuse. The copyright goes to the author, and the journal actually is responsible for doing the archiving. So there is, just as a side story, PLOS isn't the only place that's doing this sort of what's called gold open access, the broad open access. There was a big biomedical publisher before PLOS. There are lots of other non-biomedical publishers that have tried these things too, called Biomed Central. They actually publish more journals than PLOS. They were bought a couple years ago by Springer Verlag. So they're now part of Springer Verlag, and it's actually interesting. The CEO of Springer Verlag basically said that they're spending whatever it was, $200 or $300 million to buy Biomed Central was their statement that they believe open access publishing is actually a viable publishing model in the scientific field. And again, PLOS does sort of the same thing. So PLOS, which I'm happy to answer questions about, but I don't really want to talk about PLOS in detail. PLOS now publishes about 10 or so entities. First were the PLOS journals, so PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine came out first, and then they created what are called the PLOS community journals, which are a little more subject specific. PLOS computational biology, genetics, pathogens, and neglected tropical diseases. And then now actually 2007 or 2008, there was a new journal created by PLOS called PLOS One. And as an aside, it turns out that marketing plan that I mentioned before, the whole marketing plan was about creating PLOS One. So PLOS Biology, PLOS Medicine, it's a trick. It's a trick to raise the image of PLOS, to convince people that publishing in a journal like PLOS One is a viable model. So what PLOS One is about is reviewing papers solely on the basis of their technical merit. That is, you don't ask if a paper is important or interesting or novel. Anything can get published in PLOS One if it is technically sound. And that was, it turns out, I did not know this when I signed up to be involved in PLOS Biology, that I'm a gimmick of some sort. And PLOS Biology is a really good journal, and it publishes some really nice stuff, but the main goal was to convince people that publishing rapidly in a journal like PLOS One was a viable option and a reasonable thing to do. And so they get incredibly high-profile papers in PLOS One. In fact, the review process is a lot more straightforward because reviewers seem much more willing to review, and they don't have to make statements about whether or not this is important or interesting or novel, and they just get to read whether or not this thing is sound. It's actually the single largest publisher of biomedical literature right now, is PLOS One. And just a ridiculous number of papers. There are some growing pains associated with publishing that many papers, but for example, in some fields like paleontology, this guy Paul Serrano, who's very well known as the dinosaur hunter at the University of Chicago, a few years ago, he, I guess, had a new dinosaur coming out on the cover of National Geographic, and he didn't yet have a paper describing the dinosaur, and he kind of freaked out about this. And they sent their paper to PLOS One just to have a paper associated with their dino. I mean, they could have had this in Nature, no doubt, like some new T-Rex or something like that. And they sent it to PLOS One, and it turns out they love this model because they can publish 75 images of the different fossils. It's all an online journal. They can publish every single detail, whereas Nature would be like you have a page and a half, and then you can link to some outside website. So they actually, it's now I think the 3rd highest rated journal in paleontology or something like that. I mean, it's just, it's stuff they're getting because of one person basically saying we're going to use this as our place to publish high profile material. And there have been a bunch of new things. There's something called PLOS currents, which is even more rapid than PLOS1. It's basically, I wouldn't call it no peer review, but very light peer review for things in PLOS currents. And then there's a newest thing which was just launched called PLOS Hubs. They've created their first one of these called PLOS Hubs for biodiversity. It's basically a web portal for open access information about various material. So I mean, the main point behind all of this is basically relates to this. So scientific publishing has clearly worked for many years. It's not saying that scientific publishing is, good or bad or either or in between. I don't think that that's what this is about. What this is about is that we have this thing called the web, the internet. People may have heard of it, and it really changes what you can do with scientific publishing. And sticking with an old system such as pay for subscriptions to journals and have material be behind these paywalls is not necessarily the ideal model if you have a new distribution system which is cheap, like distributing stuff on the web. So what some of the open access movement is about is experimenting with new ways to distribute knowledge given the internet. And again, that's in part what Gold Open Access is about. And what I just wanted to do is walk through with some of these aspects of open access for why I think, or other people think, they're important. So, free access is not, especially in a library, it's not that hard to convince people that free access is a good thing. There's lots of reasons, like for me, looking for medical information, it's not just scientists looking for this information, it's the public, and the more access people have in general, the better. That is in part what public libraries are about. Even the ultra-conservatives as well as the ultra-liberals in the House generally seem to support this notion of public access to certainly biomedical information as well as other, they probably don't care about public access to evolution studies, but biomedical information they certainly care about. And again, I have that fact.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
So this, this is the point behind public libraries, basically. People deserve access to information. Again, I think immediate access is important, certainly for some fields. Right now, the NIH, if you get funding from the NIH, you're required to publish in a way that makes your publications available basically after 6 months, although there's a debate about whether this is going to be 6 months or a year. And this 6-month delay supposedly allows for journals to make some money in those 6 months, although that's not exactly clear if that is exactly what they need to make money. But I've certainly seen, I'm heavily involved in like blogging and Twitter and the online sort of web 2.0 science community, and we've definitely seen an enormous number of cases where if you can get the public actual access to the raw literature as opposed to processed forms of the literature, or get the press and bloggers and other people access, there is some sort of positive feedback loop where they're actually not, there's something about actually having access to the actual paper as opposed to 6 months later getting access to the paper, and for 6 months having access to a processed version of that material. The archiving, I don't know if this is a big deal, but there is this place called PubMed Central, which is a public archive of free biomedical literature. The stuff that's in PubMed Central, some of it is not unrestricted in its use, so you can go there, get material, but you can't necessarily do anything new with that material, as I'll talk about in a minute. Self-archiving hasn't worked out as well as people would hope, and I don't know if people who are here involved in like the university archive system, how we, I mean, I think self-archiving is a great thing, and I think the university archives are great. I just think that we need to work with figuring out how to get the material into those archives better than currently exists. And so I think both versions, the sort of broad public archive where everything gets deposited from certain journals, and then hopefully institutional repositories can meet in the middle somehow and cover most of the intellectual material. And then there's this issue with copyright and licensing, which I think is, personally I actually think is the most important part of open access publishing, actually. Not free access, per se. And so, you know, so a paper I published in PLOS Biology, the tetrahymenidium paper, comes with this statement. It's an open access article distributed with this Creative Commons license, which Creative Commons has created these nice licenses which are very simple. You can add to published material, and it's very clear what very clear most of the time what it means in terms of the reuse of that material. So in the PLOS publications, basically, it's a broad Creative Commons license, so it allows any reuse of the material, as long as the original source is cited. So I could take my tetrahymena paper, or someone else could take my paper on this genome, print out a little pamphlet of it, and sell it at the Giants games. And that's allowed, as long as they say where it came from. Now, they wouldn't sell any copies of the Giants games, but you know, they could, in principle, do that. And that's what the Creative Commons license, in part, is about, both trying to encourage this type of thing, but also making it explicitly clear what the rules are. So there are other Creative Commons licenses that say, for example, no commercial use of the material, or share alike. So not only you can share it, but you have to require that other people that take that material, it's like a viral license, adopt the same license once they repackage some material, so they can't close it off once they've added something to it. PLOS doesn't take that share alike, they just take the broad, you can do anything you want with this material as long as you cite the source. And I really think that this is important, and one of the reasons is, you know, who wants to ask permission for everything they do? And every journal has different license agreements and different policies, and tracking all of those permission systems is really complicated. First of all, the Creative Commons system, which is simpler, is great. And then if it's just got that statement that you can do anything you want with it, it frees you up to think about other things as opposed to worrying about what the restrictions are and what you're going to do. And, you know, there are many things that this frees you up to do. One that I really think is very important for the biomedical literature involves text mining. So, for example, you can take all the biomedical literature and do some intelligent language processing analysis, nothing I know how to do myself, but that other people work on. And you can, for example, people have designed algorithms to find gene associations from the literature. Or someone in one paper writes about, you know, gene, the CFTR gene, the cystic fibrosis transmembrane receptor gene, and they might say that in the text, they might say that we found, you know, an association between the protein and protein WB11 or something to that effect. Good language processing can find that and scrape that from all the biomedical literature and build databases of protein interaction patterns and gene interaction patterns. People have done this. They can't then redistribute the raw information behind their analysis because they don't have permission to take all of the text that they use. So you can run this on text, release the end product in some cases. Some of the licenses for some of the papers basically say you can't even do this. So they can release the end product, which is their genetic interaction, but nobody can actually drill down to the raw data behind that analysis. And I think that that's a mistake, and it's very similar to some of the issues associated with copyright. You know, whether or not the authors get the copyright or the journal gets the copyright also influences what people can do with the material afterwards. And I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't even know exactly what the distinctions are between if you have a broad open license but then a restricted copyright, how you figure out what that means versus not. But usually if you use a broad Creative Commons license, the copyright is in essence wrapped into that and makes it sort of openly available. So you know, the people in the open access movement try and distinguish between, you know, free as in cheap, like free beer, versus, and free checking versus free as in freedom. And that's what I think this Creative Commons license is about. It really just frees you up to do anything you want. So for example, part of the reason I'm somewhat sick, as some of you may have heard, is I was teaching a 700-person class for the last month, this intro bio class. Last year we videotaped this class. We actually got a small grant from the university to videotape the class. We were going to put it on iTunes. Some of the slides we don't have permission for the figure on the slides. We didn't scrape out all the stuff. We are not allowed to post the video from those classes until someone goes in and scrubs out the images that we don't have permission for. And I don't advocate breaking copyright and other restrictions, but if we had used material from Creative Commons papers for everything in that class, all the video recordings from that class could now be posted broadly for anybody to see. And I think that, that's one of the great things about these sort of Creative Commons licenses. If you use that material, it can be used for anything. You can print it in a textbook, you can post it in a blog, you can post it in your lecture slides, you can do anything you want with it without violating intellectual property or licenses. And I'll give you an example of this, which may mean less to this crowd, but more to some of the biology crowd here. I don't know how many people are familiar with much biology. But I'll give you an example which relates to my field, which is there's this great database called GenBank, which is run by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, the same people that run PubMed and PubMed Central. And it's a database of DNA and protein sequences that have been generated over the last 40 or so years by various research projects. And you can go to that database and look up a gene and get that gene sequence and do all sorts of things you want with it. And in fact, the GenBank database itself basically has a broad Creative Commons license on the data. If their data is in GenBank, you can do anything you want with that material. And that has what has been led to the biomedical revolution, in part, is this free, unrestricted access to sequence data from every organism on the planet. And that was what the genomics movement was about, and this database is what does this. But imagine if that wasn't the case. So here, I've typed in BRCA1 in human, which you may have heard there are some controversies over the tests for whether or not you have a mutation in the breast cancer BRCA1 gene, and there have been patents on it. But let's say you wanted to get the sequence for BRCA1. Here's the result in the database. Imagine if, instead of freely available, you had to pay $29.95 to access the BRCA1 sequence. So again, the patent is a separate thing. Imagine if you actually had to pay just to read the sequence, which is basically what you have to do to read the journal articles that are associated with BRCA1. So let's say you do that. You download the sequence, you paid your $29.95, you've gotten the sequence. Well, what you really want to do is compare the BRCA1 sequence to other homologous genes to learn about the BRCA1 protein, for example, and compare it to homologs across different organisms to try and understand the structure-function relationships in the protein. So you do what's called a BLAST search. You search your gene against a database of other genes, and it finds genes that it's similar to. And you can find, shows you this nice graphical map of the genes it's similar to. So let's pick out one of those genes and download it. Oh no, I'm sorry, you can't get access to that. You need to pay $39.95 to access the BRCA1 gene from chimpanzees or from another human population. That is basically what's going on in the biomedical literature right now. We could do, like I was saying, comparative studies of the literature, just like we do comparative studies of the sequences. And it will unquestionably lead to revolutions in science by doing, we have an enormous amount of information in all this literature. And there are many people who have published papers showing that you can do interesting things with this text mining, like finding new metabolic networks from these protein interaction diagrams that you can get from the literature. There was this nice article by Per Bork and some of his colleagues showing that you could do this. Amazingly, in the article they argued for the need for open access to the literature to do this, and then published it in a non-open access journal. Yeah, so here is the greatest limitation, and then they published it in a journal that wasn't open access, but we'll forgive them for that. So that, like I was saying before with my class, it's not just this comparative analysis of the literature, but in education, even in my class, so I've been teaching this class this year, one of the students took some of the material from our lecture notes that we post and posted it to this note hall site where people share notes that they're supposed to be taking about the class. They actually took the material out of our lecture slides and put it into Note Hall. And some of the material that they took out of the lecture slides was we didn't have the copyright on. And so is Note Hall a fair use site because people are using it for educational activities? Well, she's charging for people to buy her notes on Note Hall. I don't even know what the rules are here. And do we have to bring in a lawyer to figure out if she's violated some of these agreements? Well, if everything we had posted was Creative Commons, she could do anything she wanted. I mean, that may be good or bad, but at least I wouldn't have to, on top of everything else we were doing with the class, consult with, intellectual property and lawyers to figure out whether or not she did something that was bad. And in general, I think that if we do this for all of our classes here, all of a sudden everything could be posted to iTunes. We could have broad dissemination of the materials behind the classes, the coursework, the course study designs. It's not saying that you don't want to write a new textbook, for example. I have written the textbook, and Cold Spring Harbor paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to make it a better textbook than it would have been if we had just done our own work on the textbook. So I think they deserve the right to reserve access to much of the material in that textbook. But I'm saying if you wanted to broaden the access to something, this is a way to do it. This is a way to release material in a broad manner. And I do, again, free access is nice, but I really think this, as we get more and more literature into this Creative Commons mode, we will see many, many more benefits. And you can see this in Wikipedia. I mean, you may or may not like certain parts of Wikipedia, but the parts of Wikipedia that are some of the richest are the parts where people have taken Creative Commons material and enhanced some of the text that people have edited with figures from Creative Commons papers and with images from open photos of different organisms. And there's an effort to do this, like the Encyclopedia of Life is supposed to be an encyclopedia of all organisms on the planet in a semi-Creative Commons license. I mean, I think there are enormous benefits that come from this openness as opposed to just from being free. And I think that that's sort of the future. I mean, I think that it's reasonably clear that open access scientific publishing is economically viable. PLOS 1 is a good proof of that. I mean, they're supporting the PLOS enterprise because so many people are publishing in PLOS 1, and it's the author fee. So I didn't say this. The Biomed Central and PLOS journals take one approach to the cost for publishing, which is they charge authors a fee. PLOS actually will waive the fee if authors say they can't afford it, but of course there has to be money to pay for that from somewhere. Initially, PLOS got this grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation that covered some of that. For some of the PLOS journals, they have other grants that are supplementing their financial costs. So PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases, I think, got a grant from the Gates Foundation to cover publishing some papers of relevance to third world diarrheal diseases and things like that. But like PLOS 1, the author fee is about $1,000, I think, right now. And it probably will go down because if they switch to a new, better publishing system, the cost of converting material into online PDFs and online material will be cheaper, and it'll probably go down to something like, I don't know, $700 or something to that effect, which is still, if you want to publish 20 papers a year there, that still ends up being a lot of money for some laboratories, but it's certainly a lot cheaper than it was, if you want to publish an open access in some Elsevier journals that will charge you to publish what they call open access, some of them charge $10,000 right now. I think Cell is somewhere around that. But you can certainly publish without those enormous costs. And PLOS 1, despite that low fee, is making a lot of money. So, and Biomed Central, again, bought by Springer Verlag, and they're promoting it more and more at Springer Verlag. They're converting some of their other journals to open access models. So I think that they're making money is going to be feasible. I think more the question is going to be what we do about accessory issues like journal ranking. So there's still this issue, like PLOS biology is very prestigious, in part because they're very restrictive and it has a high impact factor. But the future of PLOS has been pushing things in part where you should be measuring the impact of an article, the impact of the science itself, not the impact of the name of the place where you publish. And that movement will change if that happens, if we can figure out ways to measure impact of scientific contribution, regardless of where that contribution was made, then I think that we'll have a better system for anything related to publishing. And so, I don't think, it's pretty clear that places like Nature, all the Nature journals, etc., they are already experimenting with different flavors of open access. You can pay for most of these journals to get stuff into some form to be not quite gold open access, but to be at least green open access. So I think that's done. I think that what's going to happen is where things sit on this, gold versus green open access, whether or not they use the Creative Commons licenses, where things, so, with the NIH rules and the Wellcome Trust rules, that puts enormous pressure on journals to allow stuff to be green open access after 6 months. It's not clear how many are going to go to the full, broad Creative Commons license. A lot of journals for their open access are adopting the very restrictive Creative Commons licenses, which are, share alike, no commercial, reuse, etc. But at least they're Creative Commons and they're freely available. I personally think that the next wave really relates to things like measuring the impact of individual articles. There are a lot of people in the open access movement that also think the next wave is open science in general. That is, releasing your notebook to the web, posting everything that you're doing in a broadly open manner, in addition to the publishing that you're doing yourself. And you can see this a little bit in PLOS with this PLOS Currents journal. The goal of PLOS Currents is to basically allow people to post stuff, in essence, before it's really ready for a full paper. So it was designed for the flu outbreak last year, and there was a lot of debate about how we needed rapid publication systems in order to respond to an emerging infectious disease. And the publishing industry was not capable of dealing with this type of thing. So they created this new thing called PLOS Currents, which is published through Google. So Google has this system called Google Null, KNOL, which they had created and basically nobody used, or still uses, as a really nice rapid publishing system for any type of material. And PLOS got together with Google to create this system for creating this thing called PLOS Currents. And certainly in the H1N1 epidemic last year, you saw multiple people that were literally writing papers in a day. So they downloaded the new data that came out from sequencing centers that morning, analyzed that data, and published stuff on Google Null PLOS Currents in a day. And it's not heavily peer-reviewed, and nor is it the most polished piece of work that's ever been done in the world, but it definitely served a purpose for emerging infectious diseases. And we'll see for future emerging infectious diseases whether or not that happens. There's a new PLOS Currents being done for phylogenetics. So evolutionary studies, people are gathering massive amounts of data about organisms, and many things just never end up being published because they're just sort of small incremental contributions. But it actually would help the field if people published once a week a phylogenetic tree of all the new data they have for different organisms. So the hope is that this PLOS Currents will serve as that. So I think you're going to see this merging of open science and open access to literature at some level. I don't know how far that's going to go. I'm not even, Carl can speak to this, but I'm not posting my notebooks online right now. I would love it if my lab did more of this, but we don't yet do this. But a lot of people are, publishing their daily scientific notebooks online, and it generally not having many negative problems with that, and many more positive things like I did with open data, with open notebook science. So I think these things are all happening. And, that's my my perspective on open access. I think I'll just stop there.
Well, thank you. So given that lovely segue, I'd like to make 2 announcements before we go to questions, if you have any time for questions. First is, if you're interested in learning more about Creative Commons and open science, please come to the talk tomorrow.
Submission to publishing, the average was about 2 months.
If they rejected it, it happened faster. I had a friend who got it rejected within 2 minutes.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of mythology about PLOS One, and it's grown really fast, and not even all the editors know what the policy is supposed to be. But it really is supposed to be peer-reviewed, and it is supposed to go through this technical peer review process, but just not review for importance or interest or novelty. And we've had harsher reviews in PLOS One than we have had in many other journals, but they all were helpful reviews. So all of the reviews there were not, why would you publish this, it's stupid. They were, this is what's wrong with your paper, and this is what you should fix. And we've had a lot of papers that were fundamentally improved in PLOS One. Much more, so I just had a paper in Nature, which I didn't really have a choice to publish because it was a collaborative project with 2 people from my lab and 70 people from another institution. But I ended up, I'm senior author on this paper, and it ended up with a Creative Commons license, but not a broad one. But that paper, when we submitted it, we got back reviews. One of them was somewhat harsh, but basically the reviews suggested 3 changes. Right? I mean, one of the reviews basically said it's not important enough and left it there. And the other 2 reviews said, here are the things you need to change. Whereas with PLOS One, every time we've set stuff in, we've gotten very detailed reviews, and I think the reviewers feel better because they don't have to complain about whether or not something's important or interesting. Yeah?
So it's one thing for a paleontologist with 25 papers in Nature to send it to PLOS One. It's another for a graduate student or postdoc and so forth. So, I mean, that's one. It would be easy for him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is the biggest roadblock to things like PLOS One right now, which is the reputation aspect of PLOS One. And that was part of the marketing plan that I wasn't aware of in PLOS Biology. So PLOS One now has an ISI impact factor of actually 5.5. I mean, something pretty high for a new journal. So lots of foreign people who get evaluated by whether or not they publish in things with a measured impact factor have now been publishing there. But I completely agree, for graduate students, junior postdocs, non-tenured faculty, how it impacts their career is really important. I personally think that we need to, as a supporter of open access, that what we need to do is fight to change the evaluation system as much as possible, where we're going to evaluate people by their merit, as opposed to the name of the journal where they publish. I know that that's not easy.
So you talked about the future and a bit, but I mean, how do you see, projecting 5 and 10 years out, maybe 10 years too far, a few years out, where the commercial publishing companies going to be here? I mean, just some access, full access?
I think what you're going to see is the tail end of the commercial publishers, the expensive but low subscription, not, low profile journals are going to go away. Or they're going to have to convert to some of them.
What would be an example?
Well, there's Elsevier publishes, like 35 journals associated with immunology, for example. And, many of them, they have very low impact factors, but their immunologists say they have to have access to them. And so the libraries still try and buy access to those journals. But, as back web, bandwidth, they don't have to, they've saved money by doing it, amazingly. So I think some societies are still going to fight it. I'm impressed with ecology for trying to convert over to a slightly more open access model. So I think it's going to be a broad spectrum, with some that will close ranks and say we need to bring in this money stream that supports the society activities, which I completely understand. I just think if they're creative about it, I think they can bring in that money stream through open access publishing, as opposed to through subscriptions. That's just my, I mean, it may be harder, so I think they may need to get a grant to do this, for example, but there are many funding agencies that have said if you, just like you get a grant to create a communication network from NSF for a particular field, there's no reason why funding agencies wouldn't necessarily support a grant to convert a society journal to an open access model. So,
Come from the membership, the pressure.
yeah, I mean, it's, I don't, you know, there's movement in both directions, like you said. There's some that are moving to more open, some that are closing ranks. Yeah.
I heard that you got a grant from the Sloan Foundation. Can you say a little bit what you're doing with that?
Yeah, I mean, we're just booting this up. So I got a Sloan Foundation grant that is in part about openness. It's basically, so there's this PLOS hub model, which the Sloan helped support. The PLOS hub for biodiversity, the Sloan Foundation helped support, and this is this like, you know, like WebMD or, you know, sites where you can get information about, you know, gathering information from all around. They're doing this for biodiversity. It's being run by David Mendel at the California Academy of Sciences. And they're basically going to be a portal for access to literature and, you know, YouTube videos and SlideShare presentations and GenBank entries, etc. Anything that's open, they're going to try and create this portal to that open access material, and it's going to be a place where people can go and curate information and they can share with each other information about biodiversity. And so a few months after that people started working on that. The Sloan Foundation had this new program in the microbiology of the indoor environment, or what they call the built environment. And they, as one of their 5 mission areas for this project, they wanted to create something like the PLOS Hub for Biodiversity for microbiology of the built environment. And fortunately for me, the way Sloan works is they don't put out calls for proposals for all of these things. They call up someone they think would be good for doing this, so they called me up and said, you know, you have this, you're involved in all these microbiology studies that are very similar to what they're doing in the built environment, and you have, you know, you're doing all these Science 2.0 online open access activities, and even though I'm not involved in the PLOS hubs, or I wasn't at the time, they knew I knew about them. So I put together a grant proposal that basically, we haven't committed to doing a PLOS hub per se, but we are committed to, and it just got funded, to creating a sort of vibrant online network for this microbiology of the built environment program. I mean, the grant is more than that. Actually, most of the money is going to funding us organizing meetings and workshops. Unlike many meetings and workshops, we're going to have one of these things and post, the requirement will be everything will be open. So we're going to post the talks and get people to post the slides for the meetings, and everything in this project will have an open science flavor. The hub will be one sort of component of that.
So do you think that the +1 model of looking at the impact of the journal after it's been published rather than the impact factor of the journal itself, do you think that might start to spread and move away from impact factors?
Yeah, I mean, so this relates to this issue of graduate students and postdocs and junior scientists. I mean, I personally think that the future is in measuring impact of the science after it is published rather than filtering it before it's published. And it's hard to make that transition for even myself, for everybody. We use journal names as our filtering system, both for a measure of quality as well as a measure of the field, right, and the types of things that are published there. I think with intelligent software, you can find all the articles related to a particular topic now. So that's certainly feasible. So we don't need to use the journals to find stuff per se anymore. But the evaluation part, you know, there's still part of us that knows what's going to be in AmNat, or knows what's going to be in genetics, or knows the level of quality and or, but in the end, that system doesn't actually work as well as anybody really thinks it does. I mean, having one editor and 2 reviewers be the gatekeepers of scientific quality and scientific knowledge, I don't think works very well. So I think that a new model is reasonable. But I view all of these things as experiments. I mean, we have a system. It works. But it's like I view something called adaptationism in biology, where you can observe something in an organism and you can make up an explanation for why it must be adaptive, with no evidence whatsoever. The same thing I think is true for journals. I think that the current system is not perfect. It is not optimal. And we should experiment with other systems. So really important is figuring out how to measure and communicate the quality of a publication after it is published, as opposed to before. So Faculty of 1000 was one of the first sort of broad attempts to do this. It's a place where, established people rate and rank publications, and then if you get rated and ranked by many different people and they all agree with each other, you move up in your score, and it's a way of sharing that. It's not open. So there are now attempts to create open versions of Faculty of 1000. PLOS tried to create a commenting system for commenting on articles and rating them within PLOS. I always thought this was not a very wise idea because of this. They may have heard of Facebook and Twitter and other things. I mean, I don't think any journal is going to be able to create the place for people to comment on articles just for that journal when people have their own social networks. So I think much better will be to integrate rating and ranking and evaluating journals with the current social network systems that people spend their time on. And I don't know how to, again, I view it as an experiment. I don't know exactly how to do it, because you don't just want to rate and rank things. You want a person going up for tenure or a graduate student applying for jobs to be able to cite that, to say that, because people do now, if you're evaluated by Faculty 1000, that's in people's resumes. And they use that as an attempt to, add extra value to their publication. But I do think that that is the future, and the part that we need to worry about most is, again, not like me, I worked at a genome center. I had 20 papers in Nature and 15 in Science or whatever. Who cares if I publish in PLOS biology? I mean, there was no risk on my part. It's not a fair comparison, but a graduate student who's choosing between, PLOS 1 and, let's just say, Nature, that's a big choice to make. And if we had a system that would say, if you publish in PLOS 1 and it has a high impact, that will get recognized. Then they won't worry. Then they'll publish wherever, because stuff will get seen. But I don't think that exists yet. I think that is the next problem is how we figure out how to evaluate stuff after it's published, and rate it and rank it and share that information. And I don't have a great model for it. There are people experimenting with it.
Is anyone thinking about, because there's author ID systems out now where you can have a number or something that identifies you because you're community members with the If you link post-publication evaluation systems to an author ID, H-index or whatever, it's going to work.
No, I think there are many layers of complication to how to do this. There's actually a meeting I'm going to in San Diego that PLOS is organizing on another related aspect, which is the different parts of a publication should also have a different ID. So the data, lots of people use data from a paper and don't care at all about the conclusions from the data. The data should just have its own DOI. If you, do something, make a video recording that is an important part of your paper, you could have a different DOI number for that. So there's a lot of people working on what the future article should look like too, but certainly having unique IDs for authors that you could put in your, so that is trackable on the web more easily for tracking all this would also help. I mean, there are a lot of components that would help you evaluate individual articles as opposed to the names of the journals where things are published. And again, not that the names of the journal thing clearly works at some level. I just don't think it works very well. And Harold Varmus, I just talked to Harold Varmus when we had this PLOS meeting a few months ago. He was the head of Memorial Sloan Kettering. He's now the new National Cancer Institute director. But when he was at Memorial Sloan Kettering, they basically, wasn't about open access or whatever, they basically had a policy they tried to enforce, which was for hiring at faculty level, not at lower levels, but for hiring at faculty level and for promotion and merit and all those things, you will actually evaluate the body of work of the person. That is, you will read their papers if you're on the committee. You will not just look at the names where things were published. And it makes more work. So they added administrative support for these things so that people could feel like someone could give them rather than them having to do a lot of the grunt work, they actually hired people to help them track all this information. But he felt in the end, everybody at the Institute was happier because they felt like they didn't have to fight for a cell paper per se. If they published a really good paper in molecular cell that was just as important, it didn't matter. What mattered was what they did. And he felt like it went pervasive across the whole institution when they tried to adopt this policy. But it's hard. I've been on committees where people say, oh yeah, I skimmed through this and they had a Nature paper, so let's put them to the top of the list. And you're like, well, was it retracted, for example? It's hard.
Okay, if we have no more questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Eisen for coming. Okay, and I'm going to put up a list of the other talks this week, so if any of you are interested in seeing what we have to offer, we have another talk this afternoon in the humanities, and we also have the Creative Commons talk you can mention tomorrow.